Bonjour, je m'appelle Andrew Scheps, and that is all of the French that I know. I'm a record producer, mixer, engineer. I live in England, and I make records. I first saw a recording studio when I was still in high school. A friend of my parents had a son who worked in a recording studio, and they knew I was interested because I'd been doing sound for bands in high school and also doing lights and anything where you could push a button and something else would happen. That was always really exciting to me. And they said, oh, well, you should go see this studio. So maybe I was 15 years old or something like that. And I'd always been very technical and I always loved music, but I realized already that I wasn't a good enough musician to be a musician. And so I just went. It was a very quick visit, and the guy was very nice. He gave me a copy of Mix magazine, and I saw this. And they did mostly, I think, voiceover for television and things like that. So it wasn't even a music studio, but just seeing the studio and the equipment in the studio, it was really exciting. And I saw a console, and I thought, that's it. That has hundreds of knobs, and I want to know what they all do, and that's what I want to do. It was a very split second. As soon as I saw it, I knew that was it. I went to the University of Miami. I went to school. So that's a music degree with a lot of electrical engineering classes, and then you spent all of your spare time in the studio. They had a 24-track analog studio and an 8-track analog studio. And when you had been there for a couple of years, you could book the studios to do your own projects. But when you first got there, you would assist the people who had already been there for a couple of years. So I just spent as much time as I could in the studio while taking classes and just practicing endlessly. There have been a few big projects which obviously have helped, like mixing 99 Problems for Jay-Z. That was one that a lot of people knew. Mixing some songs on the second Adele record, that was one that a lot of people knew, and that opened up some opportunities. But it's always, I feel as though there hasn't been like one event where before that time things weren't going great and now it's all easy. It's still not easy. There's still lots of times when I don't have any work and things. So it's still growing, and it's always better. I think I can look back each year and say, wow, this year there's been some really good stuff that maybe I couldn't have done 2 years ago or something like that. So it's still going. My discography is very strange. It's all over the place. So I think with some people, it's like, oh, that's the rock guy and the drums are usually a bit distorted, or, you know, the low end is huge or something like that. And I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think there's an easy way to define what I do. And I try and find out why a certain artist wants me to mix their music, just to get an idea. I'm just curious. And they will often mention a project that I think has nothing to do with them. Like rock bands talk about 99 Problems all the time. And I've had other genres talk about some of the Adele things, but they're like, to me, it's nothing like it. So in a way, that's really good, because I feel like that means some of the things I do translate from one genre to another genre. But I hope that what they're excited about having me do is that the mixes are loud and exciting, and you really get a sense of the artist and a sense of the performance and a sense of the song. I hope. The technical stuff, you have to just know it. If you don't know the technical stuff, then you can't do the job at all. So everybody who wants to do the job has to know the technical stuff really, really well. But that is important because you can't work without it, but it's completely unimportant in terms of getting through the day on a session. It's how do you deal with people, and do you understand what people want you to do with all of the technology to make it sound the way they want and to do their sort of project. But also for me, being very technical and being very early to some things like Pro Tools. I was a very early adopter of Pro Tools for lots of editing and things like that. So that helped me get some of the work because I knew some technical things that other people didn't. But once you get into the room, then the technical part is just you take it for granted, and then it's about understanding the music and understanding the people. The business is changing so much. It's nothing like it was when I started. It used to be easy, just say go work in a studio like this. But how many studios are there like this? Not very many anymore. So I think the first thing is to make sure that you actually really want to do it, because it can be very, very difficult. It doesn't pay very well most of the time. It's very long hours. And especially as an engineer, you're sort of the bottom of the totem pole. So when something does well, everybody talks about the artist and the producer, or maybe the mixer and the engineer. Nobody cares, and that can be difficult. So first of all, really make sure that it is what you want to do, because it's a lot of hard work, but is very gratifying when it is the thing you want to do. And a more specific thing, and I think this works out well, is if you're just starting out, and let's say you want to do music, you want to make records, find bands that are just starting out and try and grow with them. Don't desperately try to get on a project with a more well-known band or a bigger budget because you think, oh, well, that'll be good exposure and that will make my career. If you're lucky enough that that happens and it goes really well, well, it can really help you in your career. But if you get into a situation you're not ready for, and it's a bigger situation and it doesn't go well, then everybody knows. And all of a sudden, that's the only thing they know about you, because you don't have a history of things. So I've had many sessions not go well. I've been fired from mixing records. These things still happen, but I have enough things behind me that it's okay. It's like, oh, that was one bad thing, but people don't immediately assume it's because I don't know what I'm doing. It's just a situation. So when you're starting out, I think it's really important to try and build up, first of all, a resume. Just you can say, I've done 10 records, and it doesn't matter that nobody has heard of these records, but you have 10 records you can give to them and they can listen to. But also, that's 10 times you've done a project all the way through and managed to finish it, and on every single one of those projects, you've probably learned 5,000 things that you don't even know what they are. Because unfortunately, there is no substitute for experience with a lot of this, both in the technical aspects and just how do you do a session and how do you record a live band and keep track of everything, but also just for listening. The 20th time you put microphones in front of a drum kit, it will be better than the first time you put microphones in front of a drum kit, and you won't even know why. These things just get easier and easier the more you do them. So you just have to practice, and the easiest way to practice is to practice with bands that are beginners too. I've always had a studio, a place where I could work, and I've just always wanted to be able to do projects that didn't have enough money to book another studio or things like that. So I learned on analog equipment, but at school they were just starting to get very early digital tape machines, and so I learned those and I understood them, and they weren't new to me because they were there when I learned, but I definitely learned on analog gear. But when I started to put together my studio in Los Angeles, it was with DA-88s because they had just become available, and so I put together sort of a digital studio but with a Mackie board and then a couple of compressors, and so I was very much digital and analog. And then when Pro Tools could handle mixing, I mixed in Pro Tools for years before I had a Neve console. But then I had a Neve console, and so then I had lots of gear, and then everything was analog, and that was amazing. And then that just became very difficult, because when you're mixing on all analog gear, every project has to have its own time. If you're going to work on one song, that's the only song you can work on. When that song is finished, you can move on to the next song. And that's just not the way records work anymore. When everybody was working that way, well, that was just the way people understood it. But nobody understands mixing a record that way anymore. So it just was unfeasible. So I had to find ways to be more flexible. And then once I started to make the transition, I realized that I needed to go completely that way, because then you're completely flexible and completely mobile. I could go anywhere in the world and work. And that was an amazing feeling, to just pack up my studio in a backpack, go somewhere else, work, and nobody knew where I was. It didn't matter where I was. So it's great. And you can talk about is analog better than digital? And I think at this point, that's just a silly question. You can do anything you want with any gear you get, and there's no piece of gear that you don't have, which is the reason why you can't do something. So just make it feel great and maybe sound great too, but that doesn't even really matter. As long as it feels great, then it's perfect. So the tools are almost irrelevant. If I'm mixing a record, I mix the whole thing at the same time. So 12 or 14 songs, whatever it is, and then at the same time, I'm getting mixed comments on some other record. So there are comments and changes on 12 more songs or something like that. So all of the work that I have, I'm actively doing every day. And it just means that I don't have to say no to things. I used to have to turn down work because of scheduling, and then their schedule would change. So you very carefully line up the projects you can do based on the time, and then one of them isn't ready to mix. And they say, oh, it's going to be another 2 weeks. But 2 weeks later, you're supposed to start another project. So now you have to say, well, am I going to say no to the one that changed the schedule, or say no to the one that I've already booked from 2 weeks from now? And now I don't say no to anything that I want to do and just make it happen. I just find out when can I start and when do you need it finished by. And that's it. I don't have to say what day I'm working on a certain thing. I work in Pro Tools, and every Pro Tools session, by the time I start mixing, looks exactly the same as every other Pro Tools session I've mixed in years. So it's the track order, it's the color coding, it's making sure that the audio routing makes sense. Then I have a template which has lots of things that I bring into the session. So that's always first, the preparation. And so that's a very technical, boring thing when I'm not really mixing yet, but it's also when I discover the rough mix, and I also go through all of the tracks that are there, so I'm familiar with the 37 guitar tracks or the 25 drum microphones or whatever it is. I kind of get an idea of what everything is before I start. So when I sit down to actually work on the mix, it's a little bit familiar to me. From there, every mix is different. If it's a rock mix, you start with the drums because they're the most tracks, they need the most work and things like that. But I try very quickly to have all the instruments in. And then work on everything all at the same time. But, you know, usually drums once I actually start mixing. I always like everything to be exciting, basically. And without the parallel compression, it's not exciting for me. I don't know how to make it exciting without that. So those are my tools. But when I watch other people mix, people who I respect, you know, Al Schmidt, who's been here, and Tom Lord-Alge, and some of these people, they do things completely differently. And sometimes it's very exciting. You say, ooh, that's a new way to do something. And most of the time for me, it doesn't work for me. I try it and I get really excited, and then it's really sad because it doesn't do anything for me. And then I'm back to my tools, which maybe I feel like I'm being lazy or I should change them or I'm getting sick of them. But that's what gets the feeling to me. So even if I try something I see somebody else do and it's like, ooh, the kick drum does sound pointier or bigger or something, when I put it in the rest of the mix, it doesn't make any sense anymore. And I have to go back and get rid of it. So I think, I mean, having your own sound really is just that you finally found a way to make stuff feel the way you want it to be. And with some mixers, I think that sonically that makes their mixes very similar. And I hope with my mixes, it makes them feel similar, but not necessarily sound the same. It sounds more like the source material. But there's no, it's not that one is better than the other. I just like to think that the mixes I give back to the band are really all the ideas that they were hinting at are now realized and big and exciting and loud, and anybody can hear them. So there's no more subtle anymore. It's all, there you go, coming out of the speakers the way you wanted it to feel. I'm gonna play a couple of things that I brought to sort of introduce the idea that there is no right answer about things. Because I think what happens is, especially with students or with people who are just starting out, you tend to ask very, very specific questions about what do you do with kick drum or bass guitar? And the truth is, there's no way to answer that question because every kick drum and every bass guitar in every song is completely different. So I've brought some songs that have things that are not very typical. And so I'm hoping, I mean, I'll answer whatever questions they have, but I'm hoping that the big idea they take away is that for mixing, it's about having an idea from the very beginning of the mix about how you want the song to feel. And it could be about one instrument, or it could be about the whole song, it could be anything, but to have an idea of how you want it to feel before you start doing the technical stuff, so that all of the technical stuff is in service of the feeling you want to get, not I have to EQ the kick drum now. So which plugin am I supposed to use and what frequencies are good? And that doesn't matter. And it matters less and less the more experience you have. So when you're beginning, it does matter a little bit, but really it doesn't matter. And I think that's probably the hardest thing to learn when you're just starting out, because there's so much information you want to get that the easiest information is the specific information. But it turns out that that's sometimes really dangerous because you decide that's the way you have to do everything. And there are going to be times when it's the wrong thing to do.